Hello, I wanted to make another video about why I am not Roman Catholic. I have a video about why I am a Protestant specifically that you can find on my channel from the early years, which has some views, but it's definitely not as popular as my more recent videos. And I did a long video on why I am not Reformed that I think people really enjoyed, and so I might do some more of this with other denominations. And the first one that I wanted to start with was Roman Catholic, why I'm not Roman Catholic. And when I say Roman Catholic, I'm saying this as an opposition to the word Catholic with a lowercase c. Some of you may know this, some of you may not know this, but the word Catholic just means universal, and most Christians through most of history who have a tie to the historic church will call themselves Catholic. It appears in most of the creeds, the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith. Most Christians, honest Christians, should in some way profess to believe. Now, the main difference between my conception of Catholic and the conception of Catholic that we use popularly today is that the popular conception used today fails to actually properly apply the term. And this is my honest conviction as an Anglican Christian. Pretty common definition of the word Catholic used in church history going back to the first millennium is that the Catholic faith is what has been believed everywhere, always, and most importantly, by all. This is the core of my disagreement with Roman Catholicism, is the binding of the Catholic faith with things, dogmas, institutions that have not been believed everywhere all the time and by all genuine Christians. Now you might say, well, we have to have some boundary markers, and that is true. And the first 7 ecumenical councils lay out those boundary markers pretty well. Now, what are those boundary markers reasonably? Those boundary markers are Christological. All of the 7 ecumenical councils, I would even say all 7. Some people would say the first 5 definitely. But I would say all 7 ecumenical councils have something to say about Christ's nature, how Christ can be conveyed, how we worship Christ, how we understand our relationship with God. Now, what that is saying, that's setting the boundaries on who a Christian even is. So if we say the Catholic faith is what is believed by all, what do we mean by all? That's an important question, and the ecumenical councils resolve that. The creeds resolve that issue. What I see a lot of times in Roman Catholicism, and we'll go into this more, is the binding of other things into the belief system of the Roman Catholic system, I guess you could say. Now, this is the same reason, actually, that I'm not a Baptist. One of the main reasons I'm not a Credo Baptist is because I don't see it being practiced in the church historically and universally. If you look at the church universally, the people who worshipped Christ, and even a Baptist would agree that the Christological assessment delivered by Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Anglican Christians is the same Christological beliefs they have. It seems like infant baptism is universally adopted by the Christian body everywhere, all the time, and by all. And the reason we care about this is because of the doctrine of what's called the indefectibility of the church. This is the belief that the church as a whole will never err on doctrine or dogma. The reason we believe this is because we believe the church is built on the firm foundation of Jesus Christ, and that it can't fall and it won't be destroyed. The church is the pillar of truth. More prescient to this conversation with Roman Catholicism is the promise from Jesus Christ that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So the church won't just fall away. Many Protestants, I can concede to Roman Catholicism, tend to think this way. They think that Roman Catholicism or the magisterium or Constantine, for some reason, had the ability to destroy the church, despite the explicit guarantees from Scripture that this would never happen. So we know this can't happen. We know this won't happen. What the real problems I have with Roman Catholicism is the claim of Roman Catholicism to encompass in some way the entirety of the church, and that the Pope at the head of this church can make decisions that are binding on the entirety of the church. I think it's pretty obvious to modern Christians that even Roman Catholics will concede to some extent that the church does exist in other places. They at least recognize the validity of the orders of Eastern Orthodox sacraments. So they recognize that Orthodox priests are priests and that those Orthodox priests have the Eucharist. Now, that feels like a kind concession to our modern world, but in reality it kind of starts to break up this claim to be the capital C Catholic Church. Why? Because they disagree with the Orthodox on dogmas that they believe have to be believed. For instance, must we submit to the Roman Pontiff? That's an important dogmatic question. So in summary, the reasons I'm about to give are just extrapolations from that maybe core disagreement, that core philosophical belief that I hold as an Anglican about what it really means to be Catholic. Additionally, I have 5 good reasons I think personally I am not Roman Catholic. Like in my Reformed video, this is just my explanation for why I am not this denomination, or I don't hold to this theology, you might say. Rather than some kind of going through the Bible intensely disproving all of these things, this is an explanation of my personal beliefs and where I'm at. Now, the first and another big reason I'm not Roman Catholic would be legalism. I think it's a pretty old argument against Roman Catholicism is the idea that for a variety of reasons, Roman Catholics and their clergy have a sense of over-scrupulosity, of thinking about hell, heaven, salvation in very legalistic terminology. Now, this problem was much worse in the time of the Reformation, when there was a more concrete, more universally believed idea of, okay, if you have a sin, or, the sin can be categorized into mortal and venial sin. If you confess that sin to a priest, it can be absolved, but other times you need to do a certain amount of penance. If you do this penance correctly and in this way, you'll take this many years or days off of your time in purgatory. Purgatory, they would have said at the time more concretely than maybe today, purgatory was a place of fire where you're purged of your sins for an amount of time proportionate to your sin on earth. Now, we're going to talk later about maybe the inconsistencies of the medieval Roman Catholic position and the current Roman Catholic position, but the medieval Catholic position, I think, still has its effects today, and I do think that the scrupulosity and the legalism is still very present in Roman Catholic theology and dogma even today. While a Roman Catholic might come back and argue, well, that's what the church believed at the time, it wasn't the authority of, say, maybe a Protestant like Thomas Cranmer or you now, young Anglican, to dissent to this belief. However, this legalism at the time consistently was opposed by Eastern Orthodoxy. So there was never a moment in church history where this kind of legalistic perspective was universally adopted by the entirety of the church for all time and by all in the body of believers. The Eastern Orthodox do disagree with the doctrine of purgatory. They also disagree a lot of times with the general scholastic movement, which I do think produced in large part this kind of legalism. The scholastic movement was a movement of medieval monks and theologians, basically culminating, I think, many people would agree, in a theologian named Thomas Aquinas. And I do really like a lot of the scholastics and their writings, and I think they're very valuable. But I think what they did was they put too much emphasis on logic and reason in our understanding of God and of theology, and ended up de-emphasizing the parts of God that we cannot understand. And I think that has been to the detriment of theology, and I think that kind of scholastic version of Christianity led to this kind of very temporally focused, logical, rigorous Western church tradition, which led to eventually the Protestant Reformation itself. The second reason I object to Roman Catholicism is the claim of the Roman bishop to universal jurisdiction over the entire church. What I wouldn't do, again, as an Anglican, I believe in the episcopacy, I believe in bishops, I believe in episcopal jurisdiction, I believe in the hierarchy of the church. What I don't believe is that at the top of the hierarchy is specifically the Roman bishop. We have lots of lines in Scripture where Paul or any of the authors of the New Testament talk about the headship of the church, and they mention Jesus without mentioning the Pope, or without mentioning Peter, or without mentioning Rome as some kind of mouthpiece of that Christ-like headship, or that literal Christian headship of Jesus as the head priest and the King of Kings. We don't see there being some human institution put in there. And again, like with the first reason that I objected to Roman Catholicism, it's not hard to find dissenters to this doctrine throughout church history. The infamous example lots of Eastern Orthodox and Protestants go to is the Pope Vigilius controversy. Pope Vigilius, in the Three Chapters controversy, without getting too much into it, makes a pronouncement on a matter of faith and morals concerning the Three Chapters and the Chalcedonian controversies. He is opposed by the other bishops in the Catholic Church at the time, lowercase c Catholic Church at the time, mostly Eastern bishops. He eventually recants his original statement and replaces it with what we would now consider to be the lowercase o Orthodox position on the Three Chapters issue. Now, what Roman Catholics will usually say is, well, eventually he ended up correct, so boom, Roman infallibility or Roman universal jurisdiction over doctrine is secured. But what this controversy is not addressing or not claiming, it's not claiming that the Pope is not infallible. That's a whole other issue we can get into, maybe with this Pope Vigilius controversy. But the more pointed attack here is the issue of universal jurisdiction. If the Pope was beyond reproach, why would the other bishops at this time, without in any way addressing the potential controversy of circumventing some kind of infallible universal office, why do they oppose him? Why do they feel they have that ability? Why do they feel they have the ability, and the Pope then in some way is forced to conform to what the bishops underneath him say? I would say even today, we have a stronger version of Roman universal jurisdiction, Roman headship over the church, than we did even in the Protestant Reformation. I believe Cardinal Bellarmine, someone can quote me on this, I may be wrong, but if I'm just going off the cuff here, I do believe Cardinal Bellarmine, who is a doctor of the church in Roman Catholicism, gave the idea that he believed ecumenical councils, truly ecumenical councils, and the College of Bishops could depose a pope, or could declare a pope a heretic. So that, in some sense, puts the idea that maybe there is something above the pope. Throughout the Middle Ages as well, we got what was called the conciliar movement, which were a number of Western Christians. So a lot of the conciliar movement is after the schism with Eastern Orthodoxy. A lot of Western Christians who were claiming that councils, the church corporate, actually did have more authority than the Pope. There were wars over this issue, and again, you can look into it for yourself if you don't believe me. So it doesn't really seem like the universal jurisdiction of the Pope, the headship of Rome, was recognized at all times, in all places, by all in the Catholic faith. My third reason is actually more of a retort to a positive reason Roman Catholics often give for why you should be Roman Catholic. What they'll say is that Roman Catholicism has unity where other denominations don't. We have the Pope, he resolves all these disputes, we have a complicated, in-depth catechism, we have all of these dogmas which resolve all of these issues, so we don't have disagreements. But I would say there are places in Roman Catholic theology where there is more disagreement than there is in other places. So, for instance, I would say justification. I often get people, Thomists especially, who engage with me online or through my Instagram or through my YouTube, who will tell me that Roman Catholics do believe in justification by faith alone. Now, they hash out faith differently than Protestants, and they can tell you how they might disagree with a Protestant, but they'll cite Thomas Aquinas and say, look, he talks about justification by faith alone, and he's a Catholic. The problem with this is twofold. One, Well, there are lots of Protestants who would claim Thomas Aquinas agrees with them and not you, and Thomas Aquinas came from a period before the Protestant Reformation, so it's possible, he's not really engaging with Protestantism when he's talking about justification. So he's at very best unclear where he stands. He's not retorting Protestantism, so, it's weird to cite him against Protestants. And additionally, it does, at the very least, not seem to be the reading of the Council of Trent. Many Catholics rebuke Thomists for disagreeing with the Council of Trent by their position on justification by faith growing through charity and all these things. Now, you'll get statements like the JDDJ, which is the Joint Declaration on Justification, which I think you can, on the Doctrine of Justification maybe, which you can read for yourself, but even that acknowledges some differences between the Protestant position and the Roman Catholic position. Regardless, I do think that there is some disagreement. I can think of some pretty high-profile Catholic apologists who end up defending the idea that we don't merit or earn salvation, but that our works contribute to the reward that is salvation. And they really fight for that position against maybe a justification by faith alone position. And that seems like an inconsistency. Additionally, Thomists and those kinds of people tend to think of themselves as representing a truer version of the Catholic faith, despite the fact that, not only compared to Scotists or other Western Christians who disagree a lot with Thomism, but in comparison to now, we live in a time, for 500 years we lived in a time post the Council of Florence. There are Eastern Catholics in the Roman Catholic Church who call themselves or consider themselves Palamites. Palamism definitely disagrees with what is considered to be a dogma of the Catholic Church, which is divine simplicity. Eastern Catholics, for instance, often say that eventually they're going to take the filioque out of the creed, but that doesn't seem to square well with the history of Western Christianity. If we can't settle these issues in the Roman Catholic Church, does that really project some sense of unity? Now, people will say, oh, but the Protestant world is more divided. Now, you can pick any given issue and point out how some denomination or some group of people is divided on that one issue, but it depends on which issues we're highlighting. Most Protestants, actually across denominations, do agree on justification by faith. Most Protestants historically have believed in the filioque. Some denominations do disagree on the filioque, but if you look at like a Reformed catechism or something like that, the Reformed all agree on the filioque. Now, just because you're correct about these things or disagree or whatever doesn't invalidate you. I'm an Anglican. I do believe we're allowed to disagree, or we're allowed to have this kind of doctrinal flexibility in some of these places. What I mean, the reason I mean to critique the Roman Catholic position here is that it's undercutting one of the main reasons someone might consider to be Roman Catholic. So if I'm being asked why I'm not Roman Catholic, this might be one of my major reasons. The fourth reason I would not be Roman Catholic is the difficulty with engaging with papal infallibility. Now, this might be confusing, but let me try to hash it out. I think there's a difficulty in the cyclical nature of the claim that the Pope has never erred. What will often happen is somebody will say, okay, well, here's two statements from popes that I thought, were both ex cathedra statements about XYZ, and they seem to contradict. And the Roman Catholic will say, oh, they don't actually contradict, and here's how we should read both of these statements, so that they don't contradict. And then the skeptic will say, well, it just doesn't seem like that was the intended reading. And they'll say, well, I know that had to be the intended reading because the Pope cannot err. And it's like, well, it's kind of a cyclical argument, because when we're challenging the idea that the Pope can err, a required belief to dispel the belief that this is a contradiction is that the Pope already couldn't err. And so I find it very difficult for a Roman Catholic to genuinely prove in a meaningful way that the Pope is incapable of error. Additionally, I think something like papal infallibility and being required to believe it would require scriptural commandment to believe in that promise. What do I mean by this? Most of the things we're required to believe as Christians are established as faith we must have in God's promise. In the book of Hebrews, Paul goes through the book laying out how actually Old Testament saints were saved by their faith as well, just as we are today. So a good example of this is Noah. Noah has faith in God, but that faith isn't just a blind belief in God that saves him. God is going to flood the earth, and he tells Noah, and Noah, because he believes God's promises, builds the ark, right? So the faith in God necessitated action. It necessitated doing something. It necessitated a participation. The same thing is true about the New Testament. When the apostles tell us that we have to be baptized, when Peter tells us in the epistles that baptism now saves us, when Paul tells us that baptism, we go down in the waters and die to our old selves and come up new, we know that that is a promise from God in baptism. That's what a sacrament is. And so we participate in it lovingly, willfully, and with faith, because that is the only way we can participate in God's promises. In 2 Peter, the word Peter literally uses to refer to the sacraments are promises or mysteries. I think it's espengolmata, if I'm not mistaken, in Greek. But papal infallibility doesn't kind of have this command to people or a promise to the flock to be believed. Lines that are often cited are commandments to Peter, like when Jesus tells Peter to feed his sheep. That's a commandment to Peter as an apostle. Maybe even Peter as head of the apostles in some vague sense. That's something that Peter is obliged to do. But nowhere in the Bible does Jesus turn to the flock or turn to the sheep or turn to people and say, you must obey Peter. That's the promise that I'm telling you now, elsewise XYZ. So the idea that someone must believe or submit to all of the Pope's pronouncements is not really, in my opinion, honestly biblical. Or at least it doesn't fulfill the formula for sacraments or binding beliefs that are required upon or submission required to people in the church. Of course, there are lines about obeying leaders and leadership in general, but nothing specifically about some kind of higher office that is capable of defining dogma infallibly. Lastly, one of my largest reasons for not being Roman Catholic, and I even have a short on my video where I talk about this, but it's the dogmatization of non-salvific issues. Now, what do I mean by this? And often in Protestant Catholic dialogue, what will happen is a Protestant will point out something like Thomas Aquinas, for example, doesn't believe in the Immaculate Conception, which is a current Roman Catholic dogma that must be believed by all believers. Despite that, Thomas Aquinas is a saint, so we know he's in heaven. And what the Roman Catholic will say is, well, he wasn't in disobedience to the church because the dogma hadn't been defined yet. What that misunderstands is not that we don't get that part of the system of Roman Catholic dogmas and the obedience to dogma and that we must submit to our bishops and to the Catholic faith. All of that stuff is true. But why, prudentially, and not only prudentially, but salvifically, if the goal of the church is to save as many souls as possible, to reshape the earth, to bind Christians into one large family of believers who can bring heaven into earth, why would the church be required to make the Immaculate Conception required to be believed if it had no effect on Thomas Aquinas' salvation that he didn't believe it? Why would the church increase the amount of things you need to believe to get into the family, to get into the church over time? We can see, and someone might retort and talk about the 7 ecumenical councils again. But the difference, again, here isn't that those 7 ecumenical councils were creating new dogma that had to now be believed, but instead we're clarifying who in the first place were Christians, who in the first place was a member of the church already, who believed in the actual true dogmas and doctrines of Jesus Christ and his church, what was the received faith given to the apostles, and what was total heresy outside of the Christian faith entirely. Now, I think it's hard to argue that someone who believes everything that Roman Catholic Church teaches, except for the Immaculate Conception, they're in no way worshiping God. They don't have faith. They have all these problems. And it's impossible to argue in cases like Thomas Aquinas that he just didn't think about these issues. He argued vigorously against the Immaculate Conception. And so if the Immaculate Conception was always a part of the Catholic faith in some sense, Thomas Aquinas rejected the Catholic faith, which is, I might again remind us, is what has been believed everywhere, always, and by all, right? It just doesn't seem like these things that are being required of Christians by the Roman Catholic magisterium were genuinely the lowercase c Catholic faith. That's the end of my reasoning. I hope this can provide a unique perspective of issues with Roman Catholicism, maybe not from, as I would say, unhistorical, or dogmatic Protestantism that I think Roman Catholicism is used to rebutting. I think you can find tons and tons and tons of people trying to disprove Protestantism to make people Roman Catholic, actually much to their success, but trying to talk about how stupid or silly Protestantism is, and the only issues that they're addressing are evangelicals' complaints about things like intercession of the saints, or the way that Mary is treated. I think it's a lot easier, I can say this as a more magisterial Protestant, or even as someone who leans towards maybe an Anglo-Orthodox position, that it's much easier to prove those things were practiced in the early church than it is to prove the stuff that I talked about earlier. And I did also want to avoid maybe the issues that are pretty standard for Protestants to object to. So justification. I touched on justification, but it's not one of the reasons I'm not Roman Catholic, because again, I do think that there are Thomists who will claim they believe in justification by faith alone, and that's a complicated issue. Anyway, all I mean to say is I hope this gave a new perspective, a good perspective to engage with Roman Catholics. I'm totally open to dialogue on these issues. I'm totally open to responses, replies, comments. If you liked the video, be sure to give it a like, press the little like button. If you want to see more, subscribe, hit the little bell button to get actually notified when I make new videos. If you want to support the channel, I just started memberships on the channel for 99 cents, just so that you can get into like membership only live streams and things. Additionally, if you really want to support, I have a locals account, younganglican.locals.com, that hopefully you can support me there if you'd like. Maybe at this point in the video, it should be my current local supporters are on the screen, thanking them for supporting me. All right. Thank you so much for watching the video. Have a great day. God bless.